Hello everybody, it's Emily, and I'm so excited to be joining the gang at Hello Hemlock to talk about As For Me and My House. This is like one of the first Hamlet books I ever read, guys. I read it in my first Canadian literature course at university, and it was like kind of my gateway drug into Canlit. I don't know. I'm like Jason in that this is like one of the books that made me fall in love. So yeah, just looking forward to talking about it. Nicholas' video actually laid out some really wonderful groundwork for what I want to talk about here. And she brought up an argument that W.H. New makes, and so he's kind of talking about the pervasive aridity of the landscape. And then he writes that, quote, accompanying the unproductivity of the land is the dryness of the people. And so basically he's making this connection between people and place. It's a connection that Nicola alludes to when she mentions the wind, right? The wind in the novel it's kind of this like natural embodiment of really oppressive stasis that the Bentleys are living in. It's just perpetually just like beating down on the town, beating down on the house, and closing them in. So we see this use of landscape as like kind of a mimetic space, where the interiority of the characters is being kind of like physically mapped out onto the landscape that they're in. We see this in myriad ways. And so by way of example, we see this character's stasis in that perpetual wind, right? We see it in the dust that just kind of sits as a haze around the town and that settles everywhere. And we also see it really poignantly, I think, in Mrs. Bentley's garden. I'm gonna like collapse two passages together, because I think both are really indicative of the way that the garden is operating here as a kind of mirror to Mrs. Bentley. So on Saturday evening, May 6th, Mrs. Bentley writes, quote, so I'm going to have a garden. The way the wind keeps on and all the signs for drought, it isn't likely anything will grow. And then later, Tuesday evening, June the 6th, Mrs. Bentley writes, quote, my garden keeps coming up and burning down again. Every morning I creep along the rows, scooping away the dust and sand. I slip out usually when Philip's away or busy in his study, for a look comes into his eyes that makes me ashamed for my little yellow poppy and nasturtium leaves. End quote. That Mrs. Bentley is the one tending to this garden that just won't grow is so apt, because as Mrs. Bentley reminds us time and time again, she has not borne a child for Philip. She gave birth to a stillborn child at one point, and since then has been barren, she's been infertile, and notice here how the language that we used to talk about Mrs. Bentley's body is also the language that we used to talk about gardening and crop growth and plants. There's this really intrinsic connection that Ross underscores here between body and land, between Mrs. Bentley and her garden. Bear in mind too the epistolary form that's at work here. Jason talks about this more than I'm going to, so you can go watch his video for more on that, but I just want to pick up on the fact that the landscape that we're seeing here is a mediated one, right? Like, in a novel that's so rooted in this particular locality, we're not actually seeing the land, we're seeing the landscape as it's being framed by Mrs. Bentley in her diary entries. And in that way, there's a kind of a dislocation happening here, and paradoxically so too, because the form that's necessarily distancing us from the land is also the form that allows Mrs. Bentley to kind of draw out this really deep intrinsic connection between people and place. And so while you do have this really deep connection between person and place, there's also kind of distance, a kind of objectivity in relation to the land that's being underscored as well. And Mrs. Bentley is quite explicit about the fact that there is this kind of distance for her and Philip from the town itself. She writes, quote, there's the town, of course, but I can't join in. I might feel different if it were our town, if we had come here years ago when it was just beginning, were part of its growth and struggle, if we owned one of the little false-fronted stores, if we could share in the hopes and ambitions and disappointments of its people. But we're detached, strangers, seeing it all objectively. This passage specifically is speaking to kind of the way that they're outside of the town's society, but I think the way that Mrs. Bentley really explicitly underscores here that, like, we're objective, we're distant, resonates with the way that her and Philip kind of take up the town spatially. They're both engaged in these processes of surveying and mapping the town. For Philip, this is like done in his sketches. So like he has this artistic impulse, but it's also a cartographic one. After supper tonight, I went into a trunk and brought out 2 boxes of his drawings. I started putting the good ones away when we were first married, and now there must be 300 or 400 of them. Little main streets, grain elevators, farmhouses, big bare, windy sweeps of prairie. And some of Philip's drawings, yes, are of people. Mrs. Bentley goes on in that passage to write about some of those. But most of the drawings that we hear about are about the town, and Philip is kind of tracing out its topography. And I would argue that Mrs. Bentley has a similarly cartographic impulse. There's this repeated episode where she leaves the house and she walks out of the town. She's spatially distancing herself from it until she gets to a point where she can see the whole thing, where she can survey it. I turned once and looked back at horizon, the huddled little clutter of houses and stores, the 5 grain elevators aloof and imperturbable, the ancient obelisks, and behind the dust clouds lapping at the sky. It was like one of Philip's drawings. So like, what gives, Mrs. Bentley? Because on one hand, she's saying that her and Philip are like objective and distanced from this space. They're outside of it, they're looking at it, they're mapping it. And then on the other hand, she's drawing this like really intimate connection between her body and the land itself. And it seems to me like there's like a pretty limited scope for the extent to which you can like remove yourself from the landscape or from a space and look at it objectively if you're like so tied to it. So because I like am kind of obsessed with maps and landscapes and stuff, I've been thinking about all of this as I've been rereading the book. And I've been wondering like, A, why the cartographic impulse? And B, like, is there a tension between the fact that on one hand they're like removed from the landscape because they're surveying it and mapping it, but then they're also like characterized as the landscape? And I don't think that there is a tension there, actually. And I don't think so because of W.H. New, who's popular in Hello Hemlock this month. And so he has a book called Landsliding, Imagining Space, Presence, and Power in Canadian Writing. And like, this is my favorite book of all time. You guys should all read it. It's so good. I'm obsessed. But at one point he paraphrases Rosalind Diprose and Robin Farrell and their book Cartographies. And he writes, quote, that map making, any system of representation and codification, in other words, is bound up with the production of what it represents. A line produces space and demarcates territory, and the territory so produced is contingent upon the nature of that line. End quote. So mapping, in other words, doesn't just like represent territory, it creates territory in the process of mapping it. And in that way there's kind of an implicit power and control in mapping, because just by charting the space, you're exerting a kind of claim over it, and you're exerting a kind of power over it. So I think the idea that I find myself just like tentatively landing on here is that perhaps this kind of sensibility of mapping and map making that kind of underwrites the novel is a way of exercising control of the self. Because mapping in itself is kind of a way of controlling space through the production of representations. And what's interesting here is the way that space is so deeply and intrinsically tied to people, right? Like, think back to Mrs. Bentley and her garden. And these characters, remember, are so stuck in this like paradoxical cycle of stasis where they keep moving to these towns that are just another iteration of horizon, and there's no growth. They can't conceive a child. The garden is dying. Like, there's just this perpetual stasis that they're living in. And Mrs. Bentley fixates, kind of towards the later half of the novel, on the need to get out of that cycle of stasis, and to control it. And she does this by like really like quite obsessively like trying to collect this $1,000 so that they can move away and start this new life in the city. And I think that the kind of cartographic impulses that are at play here are just like perhaps a more subtle way of illustrating the way that Mrs. Bentley is trying to take control of the self that's stuck in this stasis. So yeah, so that's all I've got for you guys today. If you want to, you can hashtag #BeGeocritical with me down in the comments. That would be great. Also, if you're a Canadian resident and you want some free books, House of Anansi and Hello Hemlock are are totally gonna hook you up this month. So you can check out Jason's video where he talks about how you can win a copy of Bone and Bread, which we'll be reading on Hemlock later this year. Yeah, that's all. I'll see you guys later. Hashtag CanLit. Bye.